Hello folks, it's Groggy. Today is the anniversary of a rather infamous day in the history of Northwest Florida. It just so happens to be 1 year ago today when Category 5 Hurricane Michael roared ashore in Bay County. A lot has changed since that fateful October day in 2018, but before we examine what has happened since then, let's first take a look back. On October 4th, a tropical disturbance in the Western Caribbean was catching the eyes of the National Hurricane Center and various weather models. A good number of them showed the disturbance developing into a tropical storm and hitting the Florida Panhandle around Okaloosa County in about 5 days. On October 5th, not much changed, but nonetheless it was still being watched. On October 6th, the system had sufficiently developed for the National Hurricane Center to name it Potential Tropical Cyclone 14. It was forecast to hit the Florida Panhandle on October 10th as a mid-range tropical storm. By early in the morning of October 7th, the storm became Tropical Depression 14. The track shifted slightly eastward, predicting a landfall somewhere in Gulf County close to Port St. Joe as a minimal hurricane. By the afternoon, the storm had strengthened enough to be named Tropical Storm Michael. By midday on October 8th, Michael became a hurricane, right before striking the western tip of Cuba. As it was passing Cuba, the storm was now predicted to make landfall around Apalachicola on the night of the 10th as a major hurricane. After striking Cuba, the storm tried to develop an eye, but couldn't quite do so as its intensity stagnated. On October 9th, the storm strengthened further, and the forecast track once again shifted westward. The storm was now predicted to make landfall around Mexico Beach, Florida, by midday on the 10th as a 125-mile-per-hour Category 3 hurricane. Around noon on the 9th, Michael was a 110-mile-per-hour Category 2 hurricane. This is when things began to take a turn for the worse. Michael began to explosively deepen. By midnight on the morning of October the 10th, Michael had already reached its predicted peak strength of 125 miles per hour. By 1 a.m., the storm became a Category 4 with winds of 130 miles per hour. By 4 a.m., the winds had increased to 140 miles per hour. By 7 a.m., 145 miles per hour. By 10 a.m., 150 miles per hour. As the storm closed in on the area between Mexico Beach and Panama City, the clock had just run out. Michael made landfall between Mexico Beach and Tyndall Air Force Base, Florida, as a 160-mile-per-hour Category 5 hurricane, with a barometric pressure of 919 millibars. Mexico Beach caught the full fury of the eastern eyewall of the storm. It was subjected to 160-mile-per-hour sustained winds, with gusts well into the 180s, with an enormous storm surge of 14 to 16 feet. Tyndall Air Force Base fared only slightly better. Wind gusts over 170 miles per hour tore apart the base as several storm chasers hunkered down in their vehicles. Further inland, the western eyewall wrought havoc upon the greater Panama City area. Storm chaser Chris Kalura, Josh Morgerman, and Tim Millar sought refuge at a Holiday Inn in Callaway, with Derek Sibley riding out the front side next to a CVS pharmacy just a couple of hundred yards from the hotel. Mark Sudduth rode Michael out at a Hampton Inn along Highway 231 in Panama City. He placed several remote cameras in various places along the coast to document Michael's fury in different locations simultaneously. Tony Bright and Doug Kiesling rode the storm out in Mexico Beach. Doug fled the town when the storm surge began to rise, managing to successfully punch the core, and documented the eye in a remote forested area of Tyndall Air Force Base. Tony missed the eye by mere miles, and caught the unrelenting fury of Michael's eastern eyewall all on video from the condo he was using as a shelter. Michael maintained its Category 5 status for only about an hour, as it reached this strength right before it made landfall. Nonetheless, its robust intensity and high forward speed allowed it to remain quite potent as the center moved inland. Rural areas of Bay, Gulf, Calhoun, Jackson, and Gadsden counties were subjected to Category 4 conditions as the eyewall tore through those areas. It wasn't until the center was just east of Marianna that Michael finally weakened to a Category 3. Once the center crossed into Georgia, Michael weakened to Category 2 intensity. Nonetheless, the decaying eyewall remained intense, subjecting areas of southwest Georgia to wind gusts well in excess of 100 miles per hour, peaking at 115 miles per hour Donaldsonville. Michael maintained hurricane intensity until it reached Albany, Georgia, where it finally weakened to a tropical storm. Michael was able to retain tropical storm intensity as it moved across the southeast into the Carolinas, where it dropped heavy rainfall in areas that had already been saturated by Hurricane Florence just a month prior. It suddenly began to re-strengthen as it approached the North Carolina coast due to it beginning to transition from a tropical cyclone into a mid-latitude extratropical cyclone. After moving into the Atlantic, Michael became fully extratropical and gained an immense amount of forward speed. It sped across the Atlantic until it reached the Iberian Peninsula. It weakened as it skirted the coast of Portugal before dissipating on October 15th. I happen to live in Okaloosa County, just 2 counties away from Bay County, which was the point of landfall. Since I had intercepted Tropical Storm Alberto and Tropical Storm Gordon just months prior, I had originally planned on intercepting Michael as well. This proved to be too dangerous, so I stayed behind and rode the storm out at home. While we were forecast to experience hurricane-force winds, what we actually got were not even close. The top wind gust reported in Okaloosa County was only 60 miles per hour at Destin Executive Airport. In fact, this is probably the highest wind gust I managed to catch on video. I would estimate this wind gust was around 50 to 55 miles per hour. To say the least, we were insanely lucky to not experience anything near the Category 5 conditions Bay County experienced, nor the Category 4 conditions that areas further inland experienced. One of the things I will always remember about this particular hurricane was how the sky turned purple as it was moving away. Areas across the entirety of northwest and northern Florida experienced this strange phenomenon as the sun was setting on the evening of October 10th. Michael had a very intense, tightly wound core, and as such, the worst of the conditions were limited to a relatively small area. Hurricane-force winds extended only about 40 miles from the center. The radius of maximum winds, as such, was also very small, and was mostly confined to Bay County at the time of landfall. Michael, however, had a high forward speed, and as such, allowed for Michael to remain at Category 4 well after landfall. It brought Category 4 conditions as far inland as Marianna, Florida, and Category 3 conditions as far inland as Donaldsonville, Georgia. Hurricane conditions were felt as far inland as Albany, Georgia. The area that got perhaps the most media attention was Panama City, Florida. The Panama City area was subjected to the western eyewall of the storm and experienced wind gusts as high as 160 miles per hour. Wind damage was severe, with virtually all of the trees in the area that survived the storm being rendered bare of leaves and branches. Buildings with missing roofs, collapsed walls, and in some cases, buildings that were completely destroyed were a common sight. Catastrophic damage to the electrical and communications infrastructures were also sustained, with utility companies effectively having to rebuild the entire system from the ground up. Tyndall Air Force Base fared even worse. Base housing was rendered uninhabitable, and the base sustained damage severe enough to close it until further notice. Buildings that were supposedly rated to withstand 200-mile-per-hour winds were still heavily damaged. The pine forests surrounding the base were effectively leveled. But the area that sustained the worst of the damage was Mexico Beach. The small, charming coastal beach town was all but wiped off the map. All that remained of entire neighborhoods were rows upon rows of concrete slabs. Few houses within half a mile of the coast survived, and only a handful of them escaped significant damage. Local landmarks had been washed away by the fury of the 15-foot storm surge. Houses well above the areas affected by the storm surge had been blown off of their stilts. Highway 98 itself had been washed out in many spots, and the majestic sand dunes that lined Highway 98 had been completely flattened, leaving it highly vulnerable to future storms. Port St. Joe also got hit very hard. The small port city was subjected to a 10-foot storm surge that came out of St. Andrews Bay, inundating at least half of the city, gutting hundreds of homes and businesses. Wind damage is also extreme, with the dense slash pine canopy the city is known for being thinned significantly by wind gusts of over 110 miles per hour. Areas further inland fared only slightly better. The small town of Wewahitchka in interior Gulf County was hit by the eastern eyewall as Michael moved inland. Wind damage was severe, to say the least, with heavy tree and roof damage being widespread. In Calhoun County, Blountstown also sustained severe tree and roof damage, though slightly less than that of Wewahitchka. Marianna in Jackson County, which is known for Florida Cavern State Park, was hit particularly hard by Michael's still potent western eyewall right before the storm weakened to Category 3 strength. Numerous buildings were destroyed throughout the town, and Florida Cavern State Park has only partially reopened a year later. Interstate 10 through Jackson and Gadsden counties was blocked by trees in the days following the storm. So how have things progressed since then? After all, it has been a full year since Michael hit. Well, let's take a look, shall we? The Panama City area has been largely cleaned up. Hundreds of homes and businesses have been repaired or rebuilt, giving residents a sense of normalcy after such a catastrophic natural disaster. Many signs of Michael's fury still remain, however. There are still buildings that are seemingly stopped in time. They look as they did on the afternoon of October 10, 2018, as the owners either could not afford to clean up and rebuild, or simply didn't see it as worth the effort. The tree canopy is still obliterated. Panama City, once known to have a citywide urban forest, has very little shade nowadays. It'll likely take decades for the tree canopy to recover to its pre-Michael status. While visiting Panama City, I stopped at a few landmarks. This Hampton Inn off Highway 231 is where Mark Sudduth, along with reporters for various media outlets, wrote out Michael. The hotel today is a hollowed-out shell. The interior has been gutted, as the hotel sustained major roof damage, some minor curtain wall failures, and broken windows. All smiley faces on those logs. Over here is the now famous Holiday Inn Express in Callaway, where Josh Morgerman, Chris Kalura, and Tim Millar rode out the storm. The hotel has been almost fully repaired, with the front canopy being all that's left to fix. Right here is the CVS that Derek Sibley rode the front eyewall out next to. The exact same spot at that. Tyndall Air Force Base has seen slower, more gradual progress. The base has been reopened, but only a few facilities are operational. Hundreds of buildings across the base, including base housing, remain in shambles. Many areas of the flattened pine forests have been cleared, but others still contain the jungle of twisted and mangled trees. Mexico Beach, as you might expect, has seen even slower progress. The town effectively has to be rebuilt from scratch. However, the town is cleaned up for the most part. Some destroyed houses still remain, but lots that were once occupied by mountains of debris are now empty. Signs of progress are there, with parts of Highway 98 closed while they're being rebuilt. This closed section forced me to take a detour through the inland neighborhoods of Mexico Beach, which fared better than the areas closer to the Gulf. This condo complex was where Tony Bright rode Michael out, where he captured some insane footage of Michael's wrath. The canal that runs behind the complex was a debris-filled mess after the storm. It has since been cleaned out. This house, believe it or not, wasn't damaged by the storm surge. Instead, Michael's winds blew it off its foundation. Truly a testament to just how violent the winds were in Mexico Beach. An emergency berm along the beachfront has been constructed and has been vegetated with sea oats and other coastal plants. This berm serves as the foundation of what will eventually replace the sand dunes that were present before Michael destroyed them. While it may be small now, over the coming years it'll grow, and the shores of Mexico Beach will again begin to resemble their old selves. This house made national headlines for having survived Michael virtually unscathed. Notice the other house in the background that was almost completely destroyed. The berm stops just east of the Bay County-Gulf County line, where Mexico Beach transitions into the unincorporated community of Beacon Hill. The sea oats, however, have begun to regenerate on their own, providing the foundations for what will become dunes in the coming years. Port St. Joe, on the other hand, has made substantial progress. While the town was hit hard by the winds and surge, the town has mostly repaired the surviving structures. New ones have even cropped up in places where older ones were destroyed. While the pine tree canopy is significantly thinner thanks to Michael, the surviving trees are largely in good health, providing a sense of normalcy to local residents. Many vacant lots where homes were destroyed still remain, however. I actually volunteered in Port St. Joe about 3 weeks after Michael. I worked with a group of volunteers based out of New Orleans called SBP, and we helped local residents gut their houses in preparation for repairs after the storm surge had caused severe water damage. I remember the mountains of vegetative and household debris lining all of the roads in town. Those piles are long gone. Signs still remain that a powerful hurricane impacted the city a year ago, but it has largely begun to resemble its old self again. Along the Highway 71 corridor, through Gulf and Calhoun counties, signs of Michael's fury are still ever present. Flattened pine forests sit there, still looking like they did the day after the hurricane, albeit greener. The surviving pine forests are still significantly less dense, with all of the trees still bent in the direction the winds were blowing. Other forests have been cleared, and some have even been replanted with pine seedlings to try to get the local timber farmers back on their feet after a total loss of their crop. The town of Wewahitchka has mostly been repaired and rebuilt. The trees are still in bad shape, but have begun the gradual process of regrowing their limbs so that they can provide the small town with shade once again. I actually volunteered in Wewahitchka as well. I worked at a food and supply distribution operation based out of the local gym, pictured here. It's odd seeing the gym completely vacant, as while I was working here, the gym was bustling with volunteers, such as myself, unloading shipments of supplies, sorting them, and giving them out to the lines of people who were in need. This is obviously a good thing, however, as it is a sure sign that a lot of progress has been made. Further inland, Blountstown looks largely normal. There are still obvious signs of a hurricane having passed through the area, such as gas stations still missing their canopies, and trees trying to regrow their missing branches, but the town otherwise looks fairly normal. Even further inland, the town of Marianna has been largely cleaned up, and the Florida Cavern State Park is partially reopened. Considering the park itself is vast, and an enormous amount of damage to the surrounding pine forests and swamps was sustained, the progress that has been made towards completing the monumental cleanup task has been substantial. However, the scars from Michael in the forested areas remain. This is along Interstate 10 just east of Marianna. These areas within the median used to be heavily forested. They are now largely barren. Pine plantations along the sides of the interstate were reduced to sticks. Rows of what used to be towering slash and loblolly pines serve as a haunting reminder of just how potent Michael still was this far inland. The rest area just west of Marianna along Interstate 10 remains closed. In Georgia, Michael almost completely wiped out the pecan crop that southwest Georgia is known for. It will likely take decades for the pecan farmers to turn profits from their harvests once again, as entire orchards needed to be replanted. The same goes for the timber crops in the surrounding areas, much like those in Florida. While the cities and towns have largely cleaned up and rebuilt, the devastating effects on the area's agriculture will remain for years to come. At the end of the day, Michael was truly a legendary hurricane. Northwest Florida is no stranger to intense, devastating hurricanes. Some past storms that come to mind include the Miami hurricane of 1926, which hit the Pensacola area in coastal Alabama, Hurricane Eloise in 1975, which hit Walton County, Hurricane Frederick in 1979, which hit Mobile Bay, Hurricane Opal in 1995, which hit Navarre, Hurricane Ivan in 2004, which hit Gulf Shores, Alabama, and widely devastated the Pensacola area, and significantly impacted the majority of the Florida Panhandle, and Dennis in 2005, which hit Navarre. There's one thing all these storms had in common, however. All of them were Category 3s, except for Frederick. Before Michael, the Florida Panhandle had never seen a landfall from a hurricane stronger than a Category 3. Frederick in 1979 was the closest the Panhandle had gotten, and it made landfall in Alabama. Not only was Michael the first Category 4 in recorded history to strike the Florida Panhandle, it was also the first Category 5 in recorded history to strike the Florida Panhandle. That fact alone makes Michael the worst storm in the history of Northwest Florida. Michael also set several other records. Michael made landfall with a barometric pressure of 919 millibars, which makes it the third most intense hurricane in recorded history to make landfall in the continental United States. The two storms ahead of it are Hurricane Camille in 1969, which hit Gulfport, Mississippi at a pressure of 900 millibars, and Hurricane Labor Day in 1935, which hit the Florida Keys at a pressure of 892 millibars. It was also the second most intense hurricane on record to make landfall anywhere in the Atlantic Basin during the month of October, with only the 1924 Cuba hurricane having been more intense. Michael was also the fourth strongest hurricane to impact the continental United States in terms of wind speed. Michael made landfall with winds of 160 miles per hour. The three hurricanes ahead of Michael are Hurricane Andrew in 1992, which hit with 165 mile per hour winds, Hurricane Camille in 1969, which hit with 175 mile per hour winds, and Hurricane Labor Day in 1935, which hit with 185 mile per hour winds. Michael was also the fourth Category 5 hurricane on record to impact the continental United States. The other three were, as you could probably guess, Hurricane Andrew in 1992, Hurricane Camille in 1969, and Hurricane Labor Day in 1935. Hurricane Michael went on to cause $25 billion worth of damage, making it the eighth costliest Atlantic hurricane on record. Coincidentally, this figure is nearly identical to Hurricane Andrew's damage total, which was $26 billion. It caused a total of 74 deaths, with 59 of them being in the United States, 8 being in Honduras, 4 being in Nicaragua, and 3 being in El Salvador. That being said, Michael really was one hell of a hurricane. It cemented itself among the worst hurricanes in the history of the United States. It will certainly never be forgotten among the residents of the Florida Panhandle, nor will it be forgotten by any weather geek that was alive at the time. Even though the worst of the storm missed my own town, I will still always remember this extreme weather event. Like with every other major catastrophe, we can only learn from the experience. It will help us rebuild stronger, smarter, and aid us in avoiding repeating the same crucial mistakes we made in the past. It's not a matter of if something like Michael will ever happen again. It's a matter of when. And hopefully, when the clock runs out again, we will all be prepared. I hope you all enjoyed this recap. Thank you for watching.